Christmas Carol, a digital story. Victorian London, 1843. An utterly duplicitous setting for an utterly duplicitous turn of events. On one side, wealthy gents strolled with their top hats and walking sticks. Noses upturned, arm in arm with corseted ladies. On the other side, filthy street urchins navigated through waste-filled slums and alleys. Their only visitors, rats disembarking daily on the shores of the Thames. Somewhere nearer the latter, our story takes place. With all of the wealth of the affluent and all of the charms of the wretches and rats, Ebenezer Scrooge conducted business in his counting house on Christmas Eve. In the next room, his clerk, Bob Cratchit, shivered because his governor refused him coal for the fire. It is on this night that Fred, Scrooge's kind nephew, along with two benevolent men asking for donations, come to Scrooge and Marley. We find out that his partner, Jacob Marley, died this very night 7 years prior. Scrooge's response to all this kindness boils down to just 2 words: bah! Humbug! Later, Scrooge sat alone, eating gruel in his dark and draughty chambers. Despite the bitterness of the air that night, Scrooge's fire was a mere flicker. Suddenly, a calling bell began to ring, startling the curmudgeon. What followed next chilled Scrooge to the core. Dragging chains and money boxes behind him as an atonement for past sins, Jacob Marley came to Scrooge to warn him that if he did not change his ways, Scrooge was fated to live an afterlife of misery and despair. Before leaving, Marley informed Scrooge that he would be visited by 3 ghosts. Marley disappeared, and Scrooge fell into a deep sleep. Scrooge awoke, hearing the bells tolling the hour. Lo and behold, the first spectre arrived, looking not terrifying, but childlike. Taking the child's hand enabled Scrooge to fly alongside the apparition, first flying over London, then flying back in time to Scrooge's unhappy past. The spirit showed him the many unhappy Christmases of his life, filled with mostly loneliness. There were a few happy times with a former employer named Fezziwig and a woman Scrooge once loved, Belle. The spirit lingered on Belle, showing Scrooge how he pushed her away, his love for money outweighing his love for her. Regretful and broken-hearted, Scrooge sobbed and awoke in his own bedchamber. Managing to fall asleep once again, Scrooge awoke at the church bell's peal, this time greeted not by a horrid spirit or a child, but by a jolly giant. This spirit took Scrooge on a journey through the present, showing him how Christmas would look this very year. They first visited the Cratchit home, where a meager but much appreciated feast was being prepared by Bob Cratchit's wife and children. One of the children, Tiny Tim, was crippled and sickly, but his gentleness and humility warmed Scrooge's heart. The spirit brought Scrooge to his nephew's home. There, his nephew Fred and his fiancée were hosting a party and playing games and having a jolly time. Scrooge found himself playing along and protested when the spirit told him it was time to go. But before they did, Scrooge dejectedly found he was the butt of a terrible joke told at the party, a joke which brought about much laughter at his expense. It was in fact time to go. Scrooge was eager to make another visit, but noticed the spirit was growing old. The spirit told Scrooge that his time was coming to an end. But before his departure, the spirit showed Scrooge one more thing. With a lift of his robe, Scrooge saw 2 withered children underneath. The spirit informed Scrooge their names were Ignorance and Want. With that, the spirit disappeared. But before Scrooge could say anything, he noticed an imposing, darkly clad figure coming his way. This must have been the ghost of Christmas yet to come. This apparition made Scrooge privy to a conversation regarding some poor, unnamed soul. Scrooge first saw some of his business partners, joking about how they would only go to the unnamed man's funeral if a meal were to be served. He then saw some beggars laughing about how they looted the unnamed man's home and sold his belongings for whatever they could get. Scrooge found himself inside the Cratchit home. He was relieved thinking about how warm and loving this home was, but before long he sensed that not all was right. Bob Cratchit returned from church and told his wife that he'd found the perfect place for Tiny Tim to be buried, and that Scrooge saw a tiny crutch propped up along the fireplace, and knew the inevitable had happened. Lastly, Scrooge was in the middle of a cemetery. Next to him was the dark figure who said nothing as Scrooge begged to know whose death brought so much happiness. The spirit merely pointed to a headstone. Turning around, Scrooge saw it was his own. Pleading with the spirit, Scrooge promised he would change his wicked ways. He promised he would do all he could for his fellow man. He promised to honor Christmas and keep it in his heart all year round. He cried and begged and tugged at the spirit's cloak, when suddenly Scrooge awoke only to find himself pulling on his own bed curtains. He was alive! Overcome with joy and thankfulness, Scrooge was determined to share the love he promised he would. He jumped out of bed. He was light as a feather, as happy as a schoolboy. He threw on whatever clothes he could find, and headed straight for the poulterer's. He bought the prize turkey and sent it off to the Cratchits with all the trimmings. He headed to Fred's, where he celebrated with his fiancée and all of their friends. And Scrooge did hold true to his promise. He kept Christmas all year round and became a second father to Tiny Tim, whom he loved with all his heart.